We are here to hit section 30, session number 30 of Old Testament survey. We'll be in 1 Kings. If you've been paying attention, you will have noticed that I skipped the Chronicles altogether. I just won't be doing those. The Kings are going to be divided up into a number of pieces. The reason for that is the chronology, the time sequence of the books of the Old Testament. The poetic books, Psalms, Proverbs, Ecclesiastes, and Song of Solomon, fit into the time of David and Solomon. And so I will go through chapter 11 of 1 Kings, and then we'll take a break to do the poetic books. We'll come back to chapter 12 and go until roughly the era before the Babylonian captivity. We'll see the split of the northern and southern kingdoms, and then the rise of the prophetic office. And at that point, we'll take some time off for some prophets. We'll come back to the kings. We'll go back to prophets. We'll go back to kings, and we'll be looking at the prophets then in the order that I think they were written. I could be wrong, and so could all of the various scholars who've done this who disagree with me. All of us could be completely off. But it's I've discovered that it's a helpful way of visualizing the sequence of events. If we take the books of the Old Testament chronologically. And this is where we really begin to see it here in 1 Kings. So we're going to launch into 1 Kings. Let me share the screen, see if this will work properly. And I'll do presenter view, and it doesn't work properly. It used to work properly, and now it doesn't anymore. There must be a way to fix that. There probably is. I could probably handle this ahead of time and not have to do it the way it's being done. Okay, it looks like I've got my picture on the screen. If I minimize this, does that minimize that? No. Oh, hey, wow, I figured something out. Or maybe I didn't figure anything out. I don't know. At any rate, I've got my picture up on the corner of the screen, and that's what I was trying to get. Okay, the books of the Kings. You'll notice this title is not the book of 1 Kings or the book of 2 Kings, but rather the books of the Kings, because they were all one scroll in the original. That fragment you see in the background is a small chunk of the book of 1 Kings. It's actually 1 Kings 6, I believe, if I recall properly, from the Dead Sea Scrolls. And that's Hebrew from a period of around 300 or so BC. It's a very old manuscript. And I should just mention that our oldest manuscripts of the Bible, our oldest complete manuscripts, probably date to around 300 BC at the time of the Dead Sea Scrolls. Some of those may have been copied earlier than that. There's a lot of technical stuff with the Dead Sea Scrolls, but these manuscripts are roughly 1,000 years older than our oldest Masoretic copies of the Old Testament that were done mostly in Babylon during the Middle Ages. Amazing, difficult stories, all kinds of interesting stuff. But at any rate, this is manuscript evidence for the Old Testament. And one of the things that we discover from the Dead Sea Scrolls is that the text, that is the actual words on the page, the letters on the page, the vowels on the page, are remarkably stable. When we compare, say, this fragment of the Dead Sea Scrolls with the Leningrad Codex of Ben Asher, which is our next oldest, it's a medieval manuscript, with our modern printed edition of First Kings, we find virtually no differences, small differences. This old manuscript that you're looking at doesn't have vowel pointing, but you don't need vowel pointing. The Masoretes added that afterwards. When we look at the consonants of the text, they're identical to what we have in our modern Hebrew Bible. The scribes of the Old Testament period and into the New Testament period and into the Middle Ages were remarkably committed to getting it right. And they used techniques that were very advanced. So there you have that. That's a rabbit trail that we didn't necessarily need to go down, but we did. Who wrote the Kings? The safe answer, and also the only correct answer, is we don't know. We don't know. The books of Kings can be compared with the books of Chronicles as to what seems to be their primary interest and thematic direction. The Chronicles seem to have been written by people with a priestly bent. So we don't know who wrote the Chronicles, but the chronicler is the character we usually describe, was most likely a priest or a Levite. He had that kind of presupposition. The Kings seem to have been written by a prophet. Some have suggested Jeremiah. The vocabulary is actually very similar to Jeremiah, and that's one of the primary arguments, and also the fact that Jeremiah lived at about the time that the Kings were being closed out. And so he would be an excellent candidate for the job, but we actually don't know. There are no, strangely enough, there are no rabbinic traditions as to who wrote the Book of Kings. I wish there were. That would narrow it down a little, but there aren't. I've mentioned before that First and Second Kings are one book in Hebrew, but the Septuagint and then later on the Latin Vulgate separated them and ended up calling them Third and Fourth Kings. First and Second Samuel in the Septuagint are actually called First and Second Kings. That's just to keep us on our toes. We actually don't need to know that, but some of my students who may well be watching this video later do need to know that. So there we have it. One of the interesting things about the authorship of the Kings, which is unlike the Samuels, is that the Kings seem to have used historical literary sources, documents of some kind. Like today, if I were to write a history, or say I wanted to write a history of the First Crusade, uh, I wouldn't just make it up as I went along. I would go back to a library in England and read the oldest books I could find, the Song of Roland or whatever. I would read first person documents from the time. Uh, I would read Pope Urban's declaration of a crusade. I would read Peter the Hermit's sermons. I would read the decree from the Emperor of Byzantium. What I'm saying is that modern historians always use sources, and the quality of a history book is dependent primarily on the quality of the primary sources that are used. First and Second Kings cover a long enough period of time from roughly 1000 BC until roughly 590 or so BC, a good 400 years anyway. uh, that they couldn't have been eyewitness accounts from one person. The Samuels could all have been written about by a single author who was a witness to most of it. The Kings, on the other hand, had to be written down as a compilation of history. So there are actual sources that are mentioned in the Kings. And among those are in 1 Kings 11, the book of the Acts of Solomon, which was probably a court record book, Solomon's royal court. There was a keeper of the records, and every day he would write down whatever important stuff King Solomon did, or stuff that happened that maybe people would care about later on. And every day, and we call this a day book. Today we call it a newspaper. And the only legitimate uh, reason for doing journalism is to keep a first-person current account of history as it happens. The first draft of history is the daily newspaper. And this is why it is so vitally important that newspaper reporters and the modern equivalents on television and the internet go to great lengths to get the story right. When the story doesn't come through accurately, everybody loses, and the biggest losers will be the historians of 100 and 500 and 1,000 years from now, who are wondering who to believe, because everybody tells a completely different story. It's a terrible thing, but you're getting the cranky old professor here. In the ancient world, court scribes, the chroniclers of the royal court, were expected to keep meticulous records. And some of those records have come down to us, many of them have not. The vast majority have been lost. Interestingly, the best original records that we have actually come from the Assyrians, and we'll talk about them in the next slide. In the ancient Israel kingdom, there obviously were records, and the books of the kings are compilations. They're primary source-based history. So the book of the Acts of Solomon, probably from the courts of King Solomon. Then there's one called the book of the Chronicles of the Kings of Israel, which would be the official chronicler of the various kings of the northern kingdom who reigned in uh, Shechem and Samaria and Tirzah, the northern capitals. And again, we have no uh, copies of those books, of the Acts of Solomon or the Chronicles of the Kings of Israel. Chronicles of the Kings of Judah is another one we don't have, but we have quotations from those in the books of the Kings. This is very, very different from the hypothesis that the critical scholars have made about the formation of the books of Moses. Uh, the the critics have always said that Moses didn't exist and Israel didn't exist and none of this stuff ever really happened. And some people made it up over a period of 1,000 years in order to justify their taking of Canaanite land. They, to justify this evil thing, they made up this story, and there were 4 different authors named J, E, D, and P. And the Bible doesn't give us any hint of anything like that, and there is no independent historical record of anything even remotely like that. On the other hand, the Bible specifically notes the sources for the books of Kings. And these sources are utterly legitimate for historical work. Uh, we think, those of us who study these things and care about it, think that probably some of the other books of the Old Testament, and certainly some books of the New Testament, like the Gospel of Luke and the book of Acts, uh, used primary source material, interviews with eyewitnesses and that sort of thing. They weren't just written in a vacuum. So the historical basis of the Bible is not only really important for our faith, but it is established by the text itself and by all of the historical context that we can develop. Now, speaking of historical context, let's go on to this next slide. This is a picture of an eclipse. And um, the books of the Kings were probably composed in Babylon during the very early part of the captivity. And if that is true, that's the general scholarly consensus. If that is true, then they couldn't have been written by Jeremiah, right? Everybody agree? Jeremiah went to Egypt. And I think that Jeremiah is a likely candidate for the authorship. So that gives me a problem. And that means that I disagree with the people who think it was written in Babylon. There are components of the story that they take the kings of Judah all the way into Babylon and tell the story from there. Uh, I still think Jeremiah did it, but it doesn't really matter. We know that the content of the book runs from 970 BC, the beginning of Solomon's reign, 970 or 71, down to 562 BC, set in Babylon. The dating of the events of the kings is actually really precise. And the reason for that is this eclipse that you see in the background. Solar eclipses are fairly spectacular events for the people who witness them. To see a total eclipse with the actual corona of the sun is fairly rare. It's not something that happens on a weekly or yearly basis. It's once in a lifetime for most people. In the ancient world, uh, we we know that eclipses were considered uh, supernatural events. The Assyrians were the major power during a big part of the time that we call the kings. The Assyrians, in their capital, first Ashur, and then later the famous capital Nineveh, were a major power in the world from roughly 1000 BC until roughly 650 or so BC. They were finally defeated in 609 BC by the Babylonians, but they were declining in power during all the latter time. During the height of their power, from roughly 1000 BC until roughly 670 or so BC, uh, the scribes of Nineveh, the scribes in the palace, kept careful daily records of everything that was important to the king. It was essentially a daily briefing book for the king of Assyria, very much like a modern head of state, like our American president. Well, every morning, go to work, and one of the first things that happens is that the head of the CIA or his national security advisor comes in and presents to him the daily briefing. Here are the things going on in the world. These are the things that we heard overnight. Here's the news from these capitals that we care about. These are the events happening in various parts of the country that you need to be concerned about. These are your appointments today, and here's the biography on the Rose Queen of Philadelphia, who's going to be here at 2 for your blessing. All of that stuff is in the daily briefing. The Assyrian kings got the same thing. And amazingly, we've found clay tablets, literally hundreds of thousands of clay tablets from this period. It's like the bureaucrats of Nineveh had this really, really good job. They were the only ones who could read and write. So they were absolutely indispensable. And the more they wrote, the more carefully they stored it away according to their own personal, incomprehensible filing system, the more impossible it would be to ever fire them. So they made themselves utterly essential to the state. And there were hundreds and hundreds of thousands of these clay tablets, each one about the size of a brick and about the weight of a good-sized mud brick. You can imagine the filing system for a thing like this. It was phenomenal. Well, anyway, we found all of these. And among this is all of the day books, the everyday daily briefing for the king about everything important that happened anywhere in the world that would possibly be of significance to the king of Assyria. Well, it turns out that on a specific day of a specific year of the reign of a specific king of Assyria, there was an eclipse. It was reported as a supernatural event. The great god, something or other, was eaten up by another great god whose name was something else, and the priest of that second god sacrificed a goat or two in the temple, did all of the necessary things, and were able to convince the great god, what's his name, to spit up the great god, somebody else. And that's a stupid description. And we all recognize that that's idolatry and it's polytheism and it's stupid. And what they were describing was a solar eclipse. But once we realized that what they were describing was a solar eclipse that was visible in the capital city of Nineveh, we can put together the latitude and longitude of Nineveh, and we can use mathematics to calculate back, as we know the orbit of the sun and the orbit of the moon, and we know the spin of the earth, and we can figure all that together. And using a computer, it's been possible to calculate all of the times in the ancient world when a total eclipse of the sun would have been visible in the capital of Nineveh. And there are two of those that happened during the time of the Assyrian Empire. One of them happens in about 600 BC, after the Assyrians had fallen apart. The other happens on June 15th of 763 BC. Yeah, believe it or not, we know precisely when that happened. Actually, at 2 in the afternoon of June 15th, 763 BC. That means that think of this for a moment. We have an absolute date there, June 15th of 763, that is this particular day of this particular year of this particular Assyrian king. So now we have an absolutely hard date for an Assyrian king. And because we have day books that go in both directions from this king, we have hard dates for all of the kings of Assyria. Now, what also makes this really interesting is that there are connections, correlations between the Assyrian day books and other ancient empires and nations. So we have correlations with Egypt, with Babylon, with various smaller groups in Asia Minor, and most importantly, correlations with Israel. The Assyrians interacted with Israel on a number of occasions. Because of that, we can take specific biblical events and supply uh, dates that are precise to the day almost. So, for instance, a little bit farther along, 701 BC, an Assyrian king by the name of Sennacherib laid siege to the city of Jerusalem while Hezekiah was the king. And we know that that was during the 14th year of Hezekiah's reign. Wow, that is terribly helpful because uh, that particular event had to have happened, according to the day books, in about the middle of September of 701 BC. And we can compare that with both Isaiah and the Kings, and we have a precise date for a specific biblical event because of the interaction between the Assyrians and Israel. Okay, most of the rest of us don't care very much about this. The dates don't matter. Frankly, the stories are the same, and the theme of the Kings works out the same, whether we care about the dates or not. The reason I point this out, the reason I'm belaboring this point, is that the Bible claims to be history. If that claim can be demonstrated to be wrong, then nothing that the Bible says can be taken as true. So where there are clear arguments for the uh, technical historicity of the Bible, I will always point them out. And this is one of those points. This is just one. There are dozens, there are hundreds, there are lots of places to go, and I won't point them all out. But when I give you a date in the period of the kings, and I won't give you very many because, frankly, you won't remember them. Uh, those dates are very precisely known because all of these things actually happened. This is real history. Okay, politically, this story runs from David and Solomon, boom, all the way to the fall of Judah. Israel, the northern kingdom, will come apart and be taken away by the Assyrians. The Babylonians will come and take away the kingdom of Judah. So from boom to bust, all the way from the golden age to the final destruction of Jerusalem. It's quite a story. It's quite a panorama. The major uh, parallel political powers are going to be Mesopotamian. First the Assyrians, then the Babylonians. Later on, when we get into the prophets, the dates of those guys will become more important. I'll give you all of that. Egypt was still a player. Egypt has never ceased to be a nation, but they were not a major player during the time of the kings. Once in a while, they pop in for a one-act walk-on, and then they're off again. Religiously, the kings go up and down. Solomon was probably the high point with the construction of the temple, but he also introduced foreign idolatry. Oh, idolatry from all over the place that the people of Israel had never known before. Solomon married wives from all over the ancient world. These were what what we would call diplomatic wives. By marrying the daughter of a king somewhere far away, uh, you become that king's son-in-law. And the theory is nobody's going to make war against his own son-in-law. It's a stupid idea, but kings have done that kind of thing all the way up into fairly modern eras. And the various monarchies of Europe at the end of the 19th century uh, clearly demonstrated the stupidity of that idea. Uh, and I don't want to tell you all about it, but World War I happened in spite of the fact that virtually all of these people were related to one another. So it doesn't work. Anyway, Solomon married a whole bunch. We don't know how many. A whole bunch of foreign wives, and these wives were all pagan, and each one wanted her own temple or chapel or idol or whatever. And Solomon said, "Whatever." He had people to take care of that. Uh, the harem that Solomon had must have been the most disorganized conglomeration of culture and language. I can't imagine that Solomon would have ever wanted to go visit. Nevertheless, Solomon did that. That was wrong. The other kings of Israel and Judah were mostly evil. We can we can divide the kings up into good guys and bad guys. After the reign of Solomon, we're going to see the northern kingdom, the 10 northern tribes, and for the sake of learning and telling them apart, what I want you to remember about the northern tribes is that all of their kings were evil. They were all bad guys, every last one of them. And so, if you can figure out that a king is from the north, is one of the kings of Samaria or Shechem or Tirzah, uh, and you wonder, was he a good guy or a bad guy? The correct answer is he was a bad guy. None of them were any good at all. In the south, most of the kings were bad guys. Some of them were okay. There were a few good kings in the south. The other difference between the north and the south is that the northern kingdom had multiple dynasties. A dynasty would die out, a line of kings would die out, usually because they were encouraged to die out. Uh, some rival would kill them all and set up his own new dynasty. In the south, there is the one single unified Davidic line. The messianic line will go through the kings of the south. So from David through Solomon, through Rehoboam, and on through the kings of the south, all the way into the Babylonian captivity, where the messianic line continued. And that kingly line continues down to Mary and Joseph through two different branches. Uh, that's the difference. The northern kingdom simply didn't have that messianic line. The southern kingdom did, and for that reason, perhaps God was extra gracious, and so the evil that overtook the north didn't become quite so bad, uh, quite so quickly in the south. Okay, enough of that. Let's look at the purpose and theme of the book. It's actually really simple. The theme of the Kings is the inescapable connection of obedience and blessing, disobedience and a curse. Okay, so those who are willing to be obedient to God will enjoy the blessing of God in general, as a rule. There's no guarantees in life, and sometimes bad things happen to good people. But in general, the message of the Kings is that the kings and the people of Israel who followed the statutes of God enjoyed God's blessing. Those who rejected God and were disobedient hastened the destruction of the nation, and ultimately suffered God's judgment. So, obedience, disobedience, the blessing, and the curse, a very common theme throughout all of the Old Testament. Okay, let's go on. The first 11 chapters are going to be speaking of the United Kingdom under Solomon. The establishment of Solomon's kingdom is kind of interesting. This could happen in about 971 to 970 BC. And I'll remind you, 970 is a nice round number, but that's plus or minus about a year. That's a very, very accurate number for ancient history. Solomon's kingdom was established upon the death of David. First Kings begins with David as an old man. David was old, advanced in years. They covered him with clothes. He couldn't stay warm. So they found him a young woman who was willing to cuddle close and keep him warm, and even that didn't help. David was getting to be an old guy. And I can relate to that. Although I can still stay plenty warm. My problem is the opposite. I tend to get to feel too hot, and you know, I keep my wife warm. I'm plenty warm. But I understand about getting old. David was getting old, advanced in years. He'd had that problem a little earlier with a giant, and was very glad that he'd trained some giant killers before he got so old that he couldn't go out to battle anymore. And Now he's well past that. We see David is old, advanced in years. They covered him, and the Shunammite named Abishag came into him. And as that was going on, one of the sons of David is a character named Adonijah, uh, set himself up as king. He got himself some robes, and he got himself a chariot and some trumpets and some people to stand around with him. And he went out to a very public place and began proclaiming himself to be the king. And word came to Bathsheba, and we all remember Bathsheba, shameful interlude with David, but the son was Solomon. And David's intention was that Solomon would be the next king. So Bathsheba went into King David and said, My lord the king, uh, uh, you promised that Solomon would be the next king of Israel, and yet Adonijah has set himself up as the king. What do you think we ought to do about that? So David arranged for uh, the counter coronation of Solomon. So the anointing of Solomon as the king takes place here at the end of chapter 1. Uh, and Several of the supporters of Adonijah are put to death, and eventually we're going to see uh, the others as well. Adonijah didn't last long in all of this. Uh, David gave some closing instructions to Solomon. He specifically named some people who needed to be taken care of, including Joab. And Solomon did take care of that. Um, and finally, at the middle of chapter 2, the death of Solomon or a death of David is recorded. David slept with his fathers, buried in the city of David. And there is, in fact, a place that is identified. There, I believe there's a synagogue over the top of it as the city of David, or as the tomb of David on Mount Zion. And the Jews have a synagogue there, and you can go in and light a candle and do other stuff. It's probably not the right place, but it's the only place we have. It's very close to another structure called the Dormition Abbey, which is an Anglican cathedral right there on Mount Zion. I think I've got some pictures of that later on. I'll show you that. Uh, but people go there. There's the Dormition Abbey has also the upper room where the Lord's Supper supposedly happened. That's a medieval room that is virtually certainly not the right place. And right under the Dormition Abbey on one side is the Tomb of David, which is also almost certainly not the right place. And very nearby, the Muslims have built a mosque to celebrate all of it. And it also is very certainly not the right place. And so it's all a lot of fun. And uh, those of us who are scholars sometimes just bite our tongues and isn't this fun? Aren't you glad that we get to come to Israel and study history? Well, anyway, Solomon's reign is established here in chapter 2. And, this is going to happen with the death of several, Adonijah and some of his followers, Joab, because Joab was just a difficult guy. There was no way he was going to actively support Solomon. And he would be working for his own power base. So it's a little hard to know. Shimei survived, but some of the others did not. And that's the end of that. Chapter 3, Solomon prayed for wisdom, which is a very interesting thing. Because Solomon prayed for wisdom rather than for riches, God granted him not only wisdom, but unparalleled riches. It's a nice combination. Seriously, if you have to choose between wisdom and wealth, by all means, pick wisdom every time. Because if you've got wisdom, you can figure out how to make do with what little you have, and it will feel like wealth. You don't if you start with wealth and have no wisdom, you'll probably spend it all on stupid things. So always start with wisdom, and the wealth will either follow or it won't, but you'll have a happy life anyway. So I'm all for wisdom. Wisdom is a very, very important concept in the Bible, and particularly as we get into the poetic books. Solomon's reputation for wisdom lends credence to the idea that the Proverbs, the book of Ecclesiastes, and the Song of Solomon were probably written during Solomon's time. Maybe not by Solomon himself, but during Solomon's time. Wisdom is the practical ability to see and act upon life from God's point of view. Wisdom is the practical ability to see and act upon life from God's point of view. When we actually have God's perspective on life and then make decisions in the practical sense based on the principles that we know to be foundationally true, that's wisdom. Wisdom isn't a mystical thing. Wisdom doesn't change with the drifting winds. It doesn't change with tides. It doesn't change with evolution. Wisdom is built on foundational truth that is revealed by God, either in general revelation of the creation itself or in special revelation in Scripture. And when we put together our knowledge gained over a lifetime of those things that are philosophically absolute truth, and use those truths as the building blocks for making practical decisions about life. That's wisdom. I can tell you from experience that it takes experience. Young people typically lack wisdom. And not because they're bad people, not because they're never going to be wise, but because they haven't had the experience yet. Wisdom develops with time. It doesn't always, not for everybody. Some people resist wisdom with a passion and never get there. But those who desire wisdom can study the scriptures and can study the world, can study history, can study philosophy, and over a lifetime of study can develop the practical ability to discern the truth and see how to put those things into practice. Well, Solomon prayed for wisdom. And God said, well, it's a good thing to aspire to. The Spirit of God is more than happy to uphold those who aspire to wisdom. And God was willing to do that. And one of the rewards of wisdom, the reward for Solomon, was that in the process of obtaining wisdom, Solomon, you're going to learn how the world really works. And because of that knowledge, you're going to be able to take the resources of your kingdom and invest them to provide tremendous prosperity. Now, that's something that not everybody has the opportunity to do, but Solomon did. And so we find not only tremendous wisdom and thus tremendous political ability, but also tremendous economic ability. The economy of Solomon was uh, a byword, well known in the ancient world. So in chapter 3, we have some famous examples of Solomon's wisdom. The most famous is two prostitutes came to the king, and they had each had a child, and one of them rolled over onto her child during the night and smothered him so that he was dead. And the other prostitute uh, had the living child, and the one claimed that the living child was hers, and the other, and they began fighting over it. They came to the king, and they told this story. They said, "This is what happened, and that child is mine. No, it's actually mine. That's my baby. You leave him alone," and so on and so forth. And Solomon called for one of his officials and said, "Bring a big sharp sword, great big sharp one. Now grab the baby, cut him in two, and both of these women can have half of the baby. That seems a fair trade." And immediately, one of the prostitutes said, "Yes, that sounds like a fair trade. That way, neither of us will have a baby." And the other said, "No, don't touch the baby. Give her to the other, for certainly you should not lay hands on this baby." And King Solomon, looking at this scene, is, I mean, it would be clear to anyone, but it was clear to Solomon that the woman who was willing to give up her baby was the actual mother of the living baby, and he ruled that way and sent everybody away. It's an example of Solomon's wisdom. Wisdom is the practical application of the eternal and unchanging principles of God's revelation. When we know the eternal principles, we can put them to work in any kind of situation. Things just work because the principles are true. But anyway, Solomon could do that. In chapter 4, we see a list of Solomon's officials. Solomon began drafting people to do this, that, and the other thing. He began building a bureaucracy, people to keep records, people to build stuff, people to maintain stuff, people to collect taxes and more taxes, and people to guard the rooms where the taxes are kept, people to spend the money, people to keep track of the people spending the money, and people to keep track of the people who keep track of the people who are spending the money. The bigger the bureaucracy got, the more powerful it became, and the more money it spent. And Solomon was raking in more and more. It's not necessarily a pretty picture. Solomon's wealth is described in the bottom part of chapter 4. His kingdom ran from the land of the Philistines at the border of Egypt, which is the river of Egypt at Al Arish in the Sinai, all the way to the north, to the region of the Euphrates River. Solomon received tribute from kings as far away as Mesopotamia during at least some of his reign. He was, without a doubt, the richest of the kings of this area, and therefore the most powerful militarily for a good long time. This is during the period of time before the Assyrian Empire became a major power. They were a mere shadow on the northern horizon and had not yet become a major power. And so Solomon became probably the most respected and the wealthiest character in the area. In chapter 5, we see the preparations for the construction of the temple. Chapter 5 is all about the preparations for the building of the temple. By the way, that thing in the background of this picture is not the temple. And it may not even be quite on the site of the temple. That's called the Dome of the Rock. It was built at the end of the 7th century by a supposedly Muslim character by the name of Omar, who is called the last of the rightly guided caliphs. After the conquest of Jerusalem, they decided to try to rub it in. And you can see Arabic all the way around the outside of this Dome of the Rock, Arabic on the tiles. And that Arabic basically is a rewriting of Christian theology. God doesn't have a son, and anybody who says God has a son is really stupid. And there is no God but Allah. Muhammad is his prophet, but it's not Muhammad, it's the Muhammad, which is very strange. And what they're really arguing is that Jesus is not God, Jesus is a prophet. Uh, it's The Dome of the Rock is a very strange artifact in a whole bunch of ways, but it becomes one of the most important artifacts up on that Temple Mount. The Muslims worship up on the Temple Mount. It's what I have to consider a desecration of the holiest place in biblical history. If there is a holy place for Christians, the Temple Mount has to be right up there toward the top of the list. So this Dome of the Rock is a really evil thing. If at the beginning of the millennium, the Messiah orders the bulldozing of the Dome of the Rock in preparation for the construction of the millennial temple, I will volunteer to run the bulldozer. I would be a willing participant in that. I would love to hear the demons screaming as the thing is knocked over. But anyway, that again, I'm just a cranky old Bible scholar, and there are probably some more sensitive souls who would like to find a place for this thing in a museum. I'm not among them. At any rate, Hiram of Tyre, fascinating character. He's the king of Phoenicia. The Phoenicians are a pagan nation. They were never believers. but all during Solomon's reign and well into the later kings of Israel, the Phoenicians were allies. They were rarely ever enemies. They were mostly allies. And the king of Tyre, Hiram, sent servants, and Solomon ordered wood and all kinds of stone and all kinds of valuable stuff, and hired thousands of workmen from the Phoenicians to come and build. And so the temple itself was one of the great, uh, truly monumental construction projects of the ancient world. It was an absolutely spectacular project. The labor force, we're told, on this whole project involved approximately 180,000 men. In chapter 6, we're told that the construction began in the 480th year after the people of Israel came out of the land of Egypt, in the 4th year of Solomon's reign over Israel, in the month of Ziv, the 2nd month. So in the late spring of 967 or 66 BC, depending on how we count Solomon's reign, the temple was begun. And that date is 480 years after the Exodus, which happened in 1446 BC, plus or minus a year. So this is a very important date. The date of that eclipse is one of several hard points that give us a very, very precise date for Solomon's reign, and thus a very precise date for the beginning of the construction of the temple. And the fact that all of this is historical also gives us a very solid foundation for this whole section of biblical history, going all the way back to the Exodus from Egypt. To describe any of this as non-historical is frankly special pleading at a begging of the question. It's a logical fallacy. For what we have here is primary source history. So there it is, and we see the date, very important, 6-1. As we walk through this, and we're not going to walk through all the details, we see the dimensions of the temple. This is laid out in quite a bit of detail. We see the materials that it's made from, various kinds of stone, cedar, fir, hopefully red fir, because that's the nice hard stuff. The cedar also is cedars of Lebanon, which is a very hard, heavy cedar, very good construction material, and lots of gold, huge amounts of gold. Furniture for the temple is constructed in verses 23 through 38. Back in my seminary years, which, oh my, 50 years ago, my goodness, 1970. Oh my goodness. One of my professors at that time, those of you who are a little older than the average may remember that in 1970, worldwide inflation had not begun yet. It was Richard Nixon, who I otherwise sort of liked, who took the US dollar off the gold standard, and among other things, began to spend money like it was running water. And the inflation since that time has been absolutely phenomenal, many fold over $1970. So I'm going to quote you a construction calculation of the cost of building Solomon's temple in 1970 dollars. You'd have to multiply that by about 50 to get today's dollars, but I haven't had time to do that. So in 1970, this would have cost on the order of $6 billion, which, as a famous American politician used to say, you spend $1 billion here and $1 billion there, and pretty soon you're talking about real money. Uh, that was a Democrat, by the way, for those Americans in the crowd. Uh, $6 billion for one building. That would be closer to $100 billion today. It would be an awful lot of money. It would be just a huge amount of money. Visualizing a tiny nation like Israel producing enough wealth to invest it in a thing like Solomon's temple is amazing. And yet, and here's the important point, we have the archaeological evidence to demonstrate not only the existence, but the dimensions, the materials, the furnishing of Solomon's temple. This really happened. So that tells us a great deal about Solomon's economy, Solomon's wisdom, Solomon's wealth, and also leads us to understand why some of the people of Israel were getting a little tired of the taxes. So the temple is dedicated in chapter 8 of 1 Kings. We see the arrival of the Shekinah glory. Shekinah is a late Hebrew word that means the indwelling or ever-present, visible glory of God. So the indwelling presence of God came into the temple, which is a good thing. This is a part of the blessing. God didn't ever need a house and never asked for one. But he was willing to bless his people with his presence in the temple. So this is a good thing. This is all a good thing. Uh, Solomon makes his address to the people, and this is something I have always really liked. In 1 Kings 8, beginning at verse 23, O Lord, God of Israel, there is no God like you in heaven above or on earth beneath, keeping covenant and showing steadfast love for your servants who walk before you with all their heart. You have kept your servant David, my father, what you declared to him. You spoke with your mouth and with your hand. You fulfilled it to this day. I like that. You spoke with your mouth and with your hand you fulfilled it. I like that. That's good. Verse 27, but will God indeed dwell on earth? Behold, heavens and the highest heavens cannot contain you. How much less this house that I have built? Yet have regard to the prayer of your servant, to his plea, O Lord my God, listening to the prayer, the cry and the prayer that your servant prays before you this day, that your eyes may be open day and night toward this house, this place of which you have said, my name shall be there. And when my people pray from here, listen and forgive. I love this. It's a good prayer. There's a tremendous wisdom here. Well, Solomon pronounces a benediction at the end of this, makes acres and acres of sacrifices, and we see examples of Solomon's enormous glory. The Lord is going to appear to Solomon. Solomon does a whole bunch of important things, fortifies some very important places in Israel, builds all kinds of important and impressive things. He even had a visit from the Queen of Sheba. Now, Hollywood, of course, has turned this into some kind of a romance, but the Queen of Sheba would have been a diplomat. The Queen of Sheba would have been one of probably hundreds of diplomatic wives of the king of Sheba. Sheba or Saba is what we think of today as the South Arabian nation of Yemen. And that was a maritime power, a trading power in the ancient world, as much as it is today. Uh, and the king of Sheba would have been a fairly important character, and he sent a diplomat, one of his queens, to visit Solomon. So this is a diplomatic mission. She came with a significant party of people, and their interest was how Solomon ran his government, how he ran his economy, how he did things. She was very interested to discover the eternal principles that he seemed to build his practical governance upon. And this is a lot of really important stuff. Later on, the Enlightenment thinkers like John Locke uh, tried to think through this same set of principles. What are those eternal principles that government and economy can actually be built on in a practical way for the greatest prosperity for the largest number of people? And modern Western society has been built on those ideas ever since then. Those are biblical ideas. So the Queen of Sheba was sitting at Solomon's feet and learning. Unfortunately, Solomon was extremely wealthy. He was also uh, very dedicated to his diplomacy. And he was also very dedicated to his development of military power. In the upper left, Solomon multiplied horses. I really love that horse. That's the Arnold Schwarzenegger of horses. That horse is found in the Billy Rose Art Garden in Jerusalem, not too far from the Jerusalem uh, Holy Land Museum. It's uh, kind of an abstract horse, but it fits very well with Solomon. One of the things that Moses said was that the king should not multiply horses. Now, horses imply chariots, and chariots imply very high priced, very powerful military activity. Don't trust your military, Moses said, and God said through Moses, trust God. Walk with God, trust your wisdom. Solomon tried to build a huge military. In the middle picture is gold. This particular gold comes from Athens. It's not from Israel. But Solomon multiplied riches. He multiplied gold. Then another thing that Moses said the king should never do, because our prosperity is not measured in gold, but in our relationship with God. And finally, Solomon multiplied wives. This is an artist's conception of what Solomon's harem must have looked like. I think it's Bravo Sierra myself. I don't think anybody was nearly that happy. But here are a couple of what some artists think Solomon's wives looked like. And he had hundreds of them, and he multiplied them. He didn't add them, he multiplied. So we get an exponential increase in the number of wives living up on the palace. At any rate, the purpose of the diplomatic wives, the harem, was to give a kind of a Middle Eastern ambiance to the whole palace, but most importantly, to do diplomacy with all of the kings of the region. Solomon excelled at that. Because of all of these things, he was given over to the military, he was given over to riches, he was given over to this opulent lifestyle of the harem. Uh, all these things pulled his heart away from the Lord. Solomon remained a wise man. He understood the principles all of his life. but he never quite lived up in practice to what he knew to be true in principle. Wisdom is a great thing. And the biggest problem with wisdom is that once you've got it, it's kind of painful to actually do it. And those of us who have lived long enough to be wise sometimes chafe against the necessity of actually living wisely. Solomon was there. And in that, this history of the kings allows us to see Solomon as a very, very human character. He is so much like us that it's painful. And therefore, I believe Solomon is real. He's not somebody that was made up in order to justify something crazy. Solomon is a part of history, and he's an important part of Israel's story and therefore of our story. When we get together on Monday, this is Wednesday, we're going to skip Friday. When we get together on Monday, we'll begin with the book of the Psalms. I have a hunch it will take us a couple of sessions to get through the book of Psalms next week. So let's get everybody back up and running. There we go. And this and that. Okay, now I can see everybody again. Here comes Donna. Oh, yeah, I can hear them all over the place. Squealing in my ear. Oh, there's Oscar. Robin and Dolly. And Stephen and Dominator. And there's Dawn. Hi, Dawn. Okay. Thanks, guys. Thanks so much for coming. Bye-bye, Oscar.
We won't see you Friday.
We will not see you Friday. We'll see you 8:30 in the evening next Monday. Okay, Monday. All right, same time. We'll just keep up with that schedule while I have to teach on Fridays. God bless everybody. We'll see you.
God bless you.
Bless you. Thank you so much.
Bye-bye.
Namaste.
Bye, Donna.